There is something very strange happening with the current wave of George R.R. Martin adaptations. We have two shows from the same author, same fictional world, similar networks, similar budgets, and yet they feel like they were made with entirely different creative philosophies. One feels glossy and heavy and self-serious and constantly straining for tragic importance, and the other feels small and human and almost like someone actually opened the book that it was based on. On one side you have House of the Dragon, a dynastic civil war story with dragons and prophecy and throne rooms and endless political maneuvering. It looks expensive and it sounds important and it wants to be Shakespearean. Ewan Mitchell is in it, so double points. On the other side, you have A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, a much quieter recent series about a broke hedge knight and a stubborn kid walking and trying to survive tourneys and bad decisions. That contrast is what this video is about. When you look at them side by side, it's not just a matter of taste or budget or spectacle. I think it's about what each show George R.R. Martin's writing actually is. I'm not calling him that the whole time, it's a mouthful. We don't have time for that. What's fascinating is how little actual material either show is adapting. House of the Dragon pulls from Fire and Blood, this book, which is written like a fake history textbook with summaries and conflicting accounts and bullet points about who married who and who poisoned whom. The section covering Dance of the Dragons is this bit. The entire basis for the show is short and skeletal. There's almost no dialogue and there's barely any interiority. The writers kind of have to invent most of it. The conversations and the psychology and the motivations, the connective tissue between events, they're constructing rather than adapting. Meanwhile, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, this one, adapts the Tales of Dunk and Egg, which is this tiny bit. That's actually quite a lot. This big bit. It's the Hedge Knight, and they both pull from about 70 pages worth of story. You can read it in a day. These 70 pages of Dunk and Egg are so dense with character though. There are full scenes and dialogue and internal monologue, tone, humor, texture. You know exactly how Dunk thinks and you know how Egg talks. The adaptation doesn't need to invent a voice because it already has one. The source material is richer dramatically. The show has more to work with, and we've seen this problem before. Back when Game of Thrones aired, I like Game of Thrones by the way, if you couldn't tell, it was widely praised for being one of the most faithful adaptations on television. Early seasons pulled heavily from the novels, sometimes lifting dialogue straight from the page, and when the show did deviate, people didn't complain because the writing still justified the deviations. Jane Paul's storyline gets handed to Sansa. Marjorie Tyrell becomes more prominent and politically savvy than she is in the books. Even small world building details, I don't know, the giants wearing pants instead of being full frontal nude, it's much better. Technically they are all deviations from A Song of Ice and Fire though, but nobody cared because the changes felt intentional and thought through. The adaptation was a translation rather than a copy. The problems really started when the show ran out of source material. Once it moved past the published books, past scenes that had already had, structure and psychology baked into it, the cracks showed really fast. Dialogue got broader and motivations got thinner and plot started driving character instead of the other way around. It began to feel less like Game of Thrones and more like those medieval TikTok edits to Golden Brown by the Stranglers. House of the Dragon is operating in that mostly impression-y space. It's inventing huge swathes of story from a political outline, while A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is working with tight and intimate and fully written narratives. One has to guess what Martin would do. What would Martin do? The other can just adapt what he already did. So which one understands what makes Martin's writing good in the first place? We've got to start with the most basic level, the adaptation in and of itself. It's philosophy. What does each show think its job actually is? Because adaptation isn't one thing. There are at least two completely different approaches you can take. You can translate or you can expand. I'm not sure if that's already established academic lingo. That's what I'm deciding to call it. Translation means you have scenes and dialogue and psychology already on the page, and your task is to interpret tone and cast well and bring it to life visually. You're staging something that already works. Expansion means you're building from basically nothing. You're taking outlines and historical notes and trying to reverse engineer a full drama. Neither approach is worse. Some incredible adaptations are highly inventive and some you have to deviate. Sometimes you have all you need right there in the book and still decide that your vision is better, so you add skin walls and BDSM to a gothic classic. Television is a different medium. Things change. The more you invent, though, the more you expose whether you can actually write at the same level as the original author. House of the Dragon is adapting Fire and Blood. It's written like a fake medieval history text. You get summaries and dates and competing accounts. Entire wars are covered in like a few pages. There's almost no dialogue. There is no interiority, which means the show has to create nearly everything that makes television feel alive. Every argument in a council chamber is invented. The details of every private conversation between like Alicent and Rhaenyra is invented. Every emotional motivation is interpreted or fabricated, and every big speech moment is written from scratch. So even though it is technically based on Martin's work, most of what we're watching isn't actually Martin. It's more like an impression. I think when you're filling in gaps like that, there's this huge temptation to overcompensate, to make everything feel bigger and louder. Like, these characters on TV don't just disagree. They don't talk like they did in Game of Thrones. They like monologue. Politics explode into like operatic betrayals, and heavy on this because there's no build up either. If you remember Game of Thrones, Cersei sat with Marjorie's bullshit for like 4 seasons before it all builds up to her blowing up the Sept. You don't get that kind of anticipation for anything in House of the Dragon. I think this is where the fanfic feeling creeps in. Not because fanfiction is bad. I think if you add up all the time I've spent on AO3, it comes to like months of my life. You can feel the scaffolding though. You can feel the writers trying to sound like Martin instead of just adapting him. It becomes an imitation rather than a translation. Comparing that to Night of the Seven Kingdoms, it literally finished a day ago, but it was great. Watch it if you haven't. I don't think there are many spoilers in this, but you know, watch it. These stories are small, but dramatically they're very complete. They have a structure of beginning, middle, and end. They have full scenes with rising tension. They have dialogue that already sounds like Martin because he wrote it. They have interior monologue that defines the character's voice. You don't have to guess what Dunk would say in a confrontation because the book already shows you. You don't have to invent Egg's personality because it's baked into every line. So the show's job is interpretation of like casting and blocking and pacing and tone. It's translating something that already works instead of trying to manufacture something that might. And I think that difference shapes literally everything downstream. It's not that the writers are magically better, they just have stronger foundations. Because invention can be great. Early Game of Thrones invented plenty, but it worked because it was all still anchored to Martin's dramatic instincts. I don't think it's possible to adapt like how much work Game of Thrones was. The books aren't even finished, and I doubt he'll finish it now, but we're at like 5,000 pages. That's a ridiculous amount of pages. You were never going to be able to get all of that on screen. You had to invent a little bit. With House of the Dragon, it feels like the invention is the main event, and the further you drift from the source's voice, the more generic it starts to feel. Not like Martin-esque. It's more like just prestige fantasy TV, something you would watch on Apple. Both shows are very short. House of the Dragon runs 8 episodes a season, and Seven Kingdoms only gets like 6 for its first season. Honestly, in most cases, I would complain about that. You know, fantasy needs room. Like, there's so much lore in fantasy series. They need room to breathe. Politics needs build up and relationships need time. 8 episodes for House of the Dragon is not enough for us to establish a cast this large and then also care about them. It has big, massive wars and big time jumps. There are dozens of characters that you need to follow, and it's trying to sprint through all of that in 8 hours. Of course, motivations feel rushed and emotional turns feel abrupt, and everything has to be a highlight reel at this point, otherwise you just like never get through the story. Seven Kingdoms, I think, gets away with it. It's adapting short stories. It doesn't need 10 hours. 6 episodes actually makes sense in this case. The scale is smaller and the conflicts are tighter and the pacing matches the material. So one show feels like super compressed and the other feels appropriately sized. One show keeps inflating its story beyond what the material comfortably supports, and the other is just asking what's already there and how do we honor it. It's the same author and the same world, and only one of them feels like the real thing. Once you get past all the adaptation stuff, we have to talk about character. You can forgive messy politics and weird timelines, and you can forgive budget constraints, but if the characters don't feel like human beings making choices for human reasons, like they're alive with a pulse, that's like the bare minimum. Everything else kind of collapses. This is where the gap between House of the Dragon and Seven Kingdoms starts to feel less like a taste issue and more of like a structural one. House of the Dragon often feels like it builds characters from the outside in. They're not people first, they're like functions. Daemon represents legitimacy, Aegon represents patriarchy, Rhaenyra represents ambition, and Helena represents prophecy. They're pieces on a political chessboard before their personalities. You can feel that in how they talk and act, not like the acting is bad, I mean like the characters themselves. Decisions sometimes feel less like, what would this person actually do, and more like, what does the plot need to do for it like to keep going. Characters align themselves for wars and they make enormous life-altering decisions. They deliver grand declarations, but the emotional logic underneath feels thin, or at least rushed. It's very mechanical, and part of that comes back to scale. House of the Dragon is obsessed with dynasty level storytelling. It's constantly dealing with succession crises and royal marriages, coups, bloodlines, prophecies, the fate of entire kingdoms. Every conversation is supposedly historic, but the bigger the stakes get, the harder it is to ground motivation. When everything is for the realm, or for legacy, or for prophecy, it's so abstract. Characters start to sound like they're arguing ideas instead of feelings, and scenes turn into big speeches. People explain themselves in perfectly articulated monologues. You can hear the Emmy reel being assembled. The characters are like mouthpieces. They're there to carry themes of power and destiny and gender and legitimacy rather than like existing as messy, contradictory people. I don't think Martin's writing has ever been about speeches or symbolism. It's about like the tiny little human things like embarrassment and pride and petty grudges and humiliation. A lot of it is about people screwing up, and I think that's why Dunk and Egg works so well. The entire engine of Seven Kingdoms runs on personality. Dunk isn't some like mythic hero, he's not even especially competent. He's insecure and he's undereducated and he's constantly worried that someone is going to realize he doesn't belong there. Half of the time he's trying not to look stupid and he's lying out of panic. He blunders into conflict and he makes decisions because he's embarrassed or he's stubborn or trying to do the decent thing at the worst possible moment. He's relatable in a way that like, oh, I must secure the throne for my bloodline just isn't. Not that good storytelling has to be relatable, but House of the Dragon just fails in that regard anyway. Egg is the same way. He's not like a symbol of the future monarchy. He's just a kid. He's bossy and he's idealistic and he gets on Dunk's nerves. He gets things wrong, and their conflicts aren't ideological debates, they're bickering arguments like two actual people that are stuck together. It's intimate, and the stakes are rarely like, oh, the realm will fall. You know, he's thinking about like, they might not eat tonight, or what happens if he loses this fight, or he's gonna look like a dickhead in front of everyone. I think the smaller stakes makes everything feel more real, because we understand them instinctively. Everyone knows what it feels like to be broke, or embarrassed, or trying to prove yourself. Not everyone knows what it feels like to manage a civil war with dragons, or have your eyes stabbed out by your shithead cousin so you wait 15 years and then get him back by pushing him off his dragon and then he drowns in the ocean. I haven't experienced anything like that. So when Dunk makes a bad decision, it feels organic, and when Egg talks back, it feels natural. When they argue, it sounds like a conversation and not rhetoric. I think that's such a key difference in construction. Dunk and Egg is very personality driven, Plot happens because of who these people are. Dunk is too honorable to walk away, and Egg is too stubborn to keep his mouth shut, so the story grows from character flaws rather than like forcing characters to match the story. It's very inward facing, and I think inward facing storytelling almost always feels more authentic. Dunk getting his shit rocked because he beat up a Targaryen only happened because he had a silly little crush on someone. Martin has always been good at capturing the stupid small shit. Another thing that doesn't get talked about enough because it's harder to quantify than like plot holes or dialogue is tone. How stuff feels while it's happening, essentially. Tone is not something tangible you can look at, so this is one that is based on purely how I feel about it, is the sense of what kind of story you're in at any given moment. When tone is unstable, even technically competent writing starts to feel awkward. House of the Dragon has a tonal identity crisis. Scene to scene, it feels like it's pulling from 3 completely different source materials. Sometimes it's full grimdark brutality of like graphic births and child death and sudden violence. It's very shock value stuff. It leans hard into misery and gore, and 5 minutes later, it's basically a soap opera. Slow motion stares across rooms and jealous cousin lovers and secret affairs and family betrayals framed like melodrama. It starts to feel like Emmerdale with a bigger budget. On top of that, there's this prestige tragedy layer, long monologues and symbolic blocking and very self-conscious, important dialogue. Characters speaking like they know someone's gonna write this down. Individually, none of these modes are wrong, but they need like a stable baseline and a consistent emotional grammar. Otherwise, it just feels like indecision. The inconsistency can accidentally make serious moments feel silly and silly moments feel out of place. Tonal problems often read as bad writing, even when the individual components are fine, because tone is what makes everything cohere. In Seven Kingdoms, the world is kind of grey. There's hardship, but there's also humor. There's violence, but it's quick and ugly. It's not like operatic. There's politics, but it's mostly background noise compared to the day-to-day stuff. Dunk can look like a himbo. Egg can be bratty. Side characters like Lionel and Tanzel are eccentric and petty and human. The story isn't afraid to let moments breathe or undercut tension with awkwardness. You can have very simple prose or very simple dialogue, but if it's tonally unified, it feels deliberate and controlled. Something more ambitious but tonally scattered might feel messy or amateurish even if it's technically complex. Martin's writing has always had this slightly sardonic human quality. Even in dark moments, there's often a bit of irony or mundanity. Duncan Egg captures that tone, I think, almost perfectly. That being said, the most immediate thing that the audience experiences is dialogue. You can have the best plot in the world, but if the dialogue sounds artificial or cringe, everything starts to feel like cosplay. Characters stop feeling like people and start being like, actors. Nowhere is the difference between these two shows more obvious than in how people talk. House of the Dragon often sounds like it's trying very hard to sound important, whereas Night of the Seven Kingdoms sounds mostly like people just talking. House of the Dragon has what I can only describe as monologue disease. Everyone is always giving a speech. Not just like kings or generals, I mean literally everyone, all the time. Private conversations turn into like these big declarations. Arguments are these philosophical statements. It's very pseudo-Shakespearean. Lots of formal phrasing and lots of grand metaphors, and after a while it starts to feel very theatrical and not in like the fun good way. You're watching very good actors perform very important dialogue. When the stakes are always like the realm or legacy, dialogue naturally becomes abstract. Characters talk in terms of destiny or legacy or duty or history. Big words, big concepts, but big concepts aren't how people actually speak, especially not in private. The dialogue in those stories is weirdly plain and awkward at times. Dunk doesn't talk like a hero, he talks like a guy who didn't get much schooling. His sentences are short and simple, and he repeats himself. He gets flustered, he says the wrong thing, and he has to backtrack. Egg is sharp and bratty and overly formal in that very like specific kid trying to sound older than he is, or kid trying to hide his secret identity is. There's also the class element here that matters. House of the Dragon mostly follows royalty, nobles and councillors, people raised to speak formally, so you could argue that elevated language is It makes sense. It's important. Dunk and Egg lives mostly among hedge knights and stable boys and innkeepers and petty lords, working people and travellers. The speech is naturally rougher and more practical, which I think fits Martin's strengths perfectly. He's very good at dialect without overdoing it. Another place where this feels different is purely visual. You can watch 30 seconds of each series and immediately understand what kind of story you're about to get. House of the Dragon leans heavily into polish. Everything is clean and composed and symmetrical, like big fuck off throne rooms and beautiful armor and expensive looking fabrics. It's very like medieval IKEA showroom at times. There's a very stagey quality to all of it, as if the sets are like waiting for the actors to walk in rather than them just like existing independently. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. It's very annoying. Something small but telling. Characters frequently have like one outfit. These are rich people. They live in a big castle and they all wear one dress. It's the same thing, like the same armor, the same clothes, the same cloak, episode after episode, which sounds nitpicky, but costume repetition without like visible wear makes a world feel very artificial. It works in Doctor Who. It does not work here. Like, they're rich. Why does Alison only wear one green dress? The same green dress every time. You add in the heavy CGI, the dragons, and the digital backdrops, and sweeping castle shots, and the whole thing starts to feel slightly untouchable. It's very spectacular, but it is distant. Comparing that to Dunk and Egg, the visual philosophy is basically the opposite. Everything looks handled, everything is muddy and greasy and kind of gross. Even the way that the shots tend to feel looser. They're less symmetrical and they're less posed. They're more handheld or naturalistic. These scenes often use diegetic lighting, sunlight through windows or firelights or overcast skies instead of like big dramatic painterly lighting that House of the Dragon loves. The difference in framing changes how authentic everything feels. Dunk's armor being cheap and ill-fitting tells you more about him than a speech ever could. His shield getting painted and him coming up with a sigil is an event because you understand how rare and important this upgrade is. House of the Dragon, a lot of the world feels symbolic rather than material. Its imagery is designed to look impressive, but I think Martin's writing thrives on believability, or at least an ounce of realism over that. His books constantly describe food and fabrics and smells and weather, the annoying physical details of life. His world building is very tactile, so when an adaptation leans into polish and spectacle, it ironically drifts away from the spirit of the text. I am such a bitch about pacing. If a show is too slow or too fast, it completely ruins it for me. How much a story is being crammed into how little time really changes how I view it. Structure is emotional. The way information is delivered directly affects how much we care about it. Like I said before, it's like 8 episodes, 6 for Seven Kingdoms. That is not enough time. House of the Dragon is covering like hundreds of years of history in 90 pages, and that's the stuff we don't even see. They have so much lore to cover. The sheer size of the cast, dozens of nobles and relatives and advisors and dragon riders, and the show becomes incredibly dense. Names blur together. Like, seriously, come on, we've got Aegon, Aerys, Aenys, uh, Aeron, Daeron, Aemond, Daemon, Daenerys, Rhaegar, Rhaenys, Viserys, Jaehaerys, and like a million more. I'm never gonna remember all of that. You can show me those characters like 800. This is Martin's fault. It gets to a point, dude. Come up with some new names. You're constantly recalibrating like who is related to who and why it matters. Like, you need like maps and graphs and stuff to figure this shit out. Another thing, I don't think the casting was bad. I think House of the Dragon and Seven Kingdoms did absolute perfect casting both times. Matt Smith as Daemon Targaryen is perfect. Like, you could not get better than that. Everyone was really great in their roles. I've never seen someone look more Targaryen than Emma Darcy. They are perfect for it. Anyway, the Dunk and Egg stories are aggressively simple. Like I said before, there is a big overriding arc for all 6 episodes, but like each episode has a very simple beginning, middle, and end. You're not struggling to remember the names or track time jumps. You're free to actually feel what's happening. Seven Kingdoms has maybe 4 characters to keep up with right now. House of the Dragon, we're on like 9 or 10 at this point. I think when Seven Kingdoms dips into backstory or flashbacks, they're placed with purpose and not just like dumped randomly for lore. Like the mid-fight flashback in episode 5, right when Dunk's about to die and everything feels hopeless, instead of pausing the story for exposition, the memory hits at the exact emotional peak. You see why he fights and what drives him and what's at stake personally, then you snap back to the present and he gets up. It deepens the moment instead of interrupting it, or at least I thought. So I've seen some conflicting reviews. Instead of clean narrative arcs in House of the Dragon, things are just kind of dropped in whenever. You get this sprawling, slightly messy sequence of events, barely a sequence of events, everything's a bit choppy and changey. It fits the idea of history, sure, but like it's not always great TV. I think Dunk and Egg follows the chain almost perfectly. Every problem grows directly out of the last decision. You can trace the line. Even though House of the Dragon has bigger events and bigger stakes, Dunk and Egg often lands harder emotionally simply because it's shaped better. Night of the Seven Kingdoms is essentially a single point of view storytelling. We are with Dunk the whole time. We learn information when he learns it. We misunderstand things when he misunderstands them. We walk into places at his eye level. It all limits the frame, which sounds restrictive, but emotionally it's quite powerful because limitation creates intimacy. Egg also benefits from this like single point of view thing. We see him as Dunk sees him as a kid and then gradually something more complicated. We don't cut away at any point to like his backstory or anything. We see him presently as just Egg. House of the Dragon is full of completely different points of view, and in theory that's not a problem because, again, Game of Thrones did it pretty well. But the key, difference is pacing. Thrones understood focus. Even with a big cast, each episode usually had a clear emotional spine. You spend real time with these characters, 10-15 minutes of, uninterrupted development for them, long enough to sink into their headspace before moving on. The scenes in House of the Dragon feel shorter and more fragmented and more functional. You're kind of checking in every now and then. No one feels like the anchor. Who is the story about? Is it Rhaenyra, Alicent, Daemon, the kids? It's just constantly, and it gets annoying. This is my last point, I swear, on God. Expectation. Genre framing changes how we judge everything that follows. Before the series airs, the audience has already decided what kind of experience they're about to have. I think that preconception dramatically changes what good even means. House of the Dragon markets itself as an epic prestige fantasy. It's positioned as the heir to Game of Thrones. It's like the next event television and the big dynastic war fantastical dragon show, the successor to the biggest fantasy series ever made. So immediately the bar is not is this good? It's, does this feel as monumental as Game of Thrones did? Which is an almost impossible standard because Game of Thrones was absolutely insane. It dominated so much. There was weekly Discord, massive ensemble, there was years of accumulated attachment. House of the Dragon inherits all of those expectations, but none of the runway. It has to feel huge right away, and I think that pressure leaks into the creative decisions because everything has to be bigger. The politics and the betrayals and the speeches and the dragons and the tragedy, they're all massive. The show feels like it's trying so hard to be important and audiences feel the strain. Scenes start to feel engineered instead of lived in. Moments feel designed for trailers or awards reels. Seven Kingdoms, I think, was framed completely differently. It's closer to a character drama that just happens to take place in Westeros. There aren't promises of continent-spanning wars or dragon battles every week. The pitch is basically, here's a knight, here's a kid, he's called Egg and he looks like an egg, and they walk around and things happen. Seven Kingdoms' lower expectations actually align better with the source material's strength. It's allowed to be modest. When a show promises enormity and delivers something merely pretty good. It feels disappointing. There's something quite refreshing about a fantasy show that doesn't feel obligated to constantly prove how expensive it is. House of the Dragon is constantly building outwards and expanding and inventing and amplifying. It's adapting a fake history chronicle and trying to transform footnotes into tragedy. That means more fabrication and more explanation, more speechifying, bigger sets, bigger battles, bigger emotions. It's chasing the scale and cultural weight of Game of Thrones. Seven Kingdoms does almost the opposite. It's adapting fully written stories with a clear voice and tight structure. It doesn't need to overcompensate. The show stays grounded in one point of view and in small stakes and muddy roads and awkward conversations and pride and hunger and embarrassment and Dunk being a himbo. If you watched all of that, thanks. I want to know what you thought of it. I know A Night of the Seven Kingdoms literally just finished, and you should watch it if you haven't already. It was definitely worth the 2-year wait. Bye!